Chapter 2 Shadows of the Past. Ray jolted awake, the thick, humid air of the Yucatán jungle pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. He sat up, muscles tense, his heart still racing from the nightmare that clung to the edges of his mind. "Ray, El Jefe wants to see you," a voice barked from outside his tent. Ray grunted, running a hand over his face, his jaw clenched instinctively at the mention of his boss, the man they were all told to call Jefe. No one knew his real name and no one dared to ask. In this line of work, questions were dangerous. Splashing water on his face from a nearby basin, Ray's reflection wavered. For a moment he saw a different face staring back, a younger version of himself, eyes filled with pain and confusion. 20 years earlier. The apartment was suffocating, the air heavy with anger and resentment. Young Ray crouched behind the tattered couch, peeking out just enough to see his parents arguing in the cramped living room. "You're nothing but a loser, Miguel," his mother spat, her face twisted with contempt. "You think struggling to make ends meet is a life? I deserve better than this." His father's shoulders slumped, eyes bloodshot and hollow. "I work hard. I provide for this family." "Provide? For what? Scraps?" She threw her hands up in frustration. "Hector can give me more. He can give me everything you can't." Ray's stomach turned. Hector. The name of the cartel leader echoed in his mind, a man who wore expensive suits and flashed gold watches, a man who had stolen his mother away. "You're leaving. For him." Miguel's voice broke, his hands trembling. She didn't meet his gaze. "I'm tired of struggling. I want a life worth living." Ray wanted to scream, to beg her to stay, but his voice caught in his throat. She was already at the door, suitcase in hand, her heels clicking on the floor as she walked out. The door slammed shut. His father sank to his knees, his face crumpling as he reached for the bottle on the table. The glass clinked as he poured, his hands shaking. From that day on, the bottle became his father's crutch, the only thing he could rely on. And Ray watched, helpless, as the man he once looked up to drowned his pain, one drink at a time. "Ray, you deaf? Jefe's waiting." The voice snapped him back to reality. "Yeah, I'm coming," Ray muttered, pulling on his boots. He emerged from the tent, the oppressive jungle heat immediately enveloping him. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation, a constant reminder of the harsh environment they were in. The cartel's camp was bustling with activity, men loading crates and weapons, their faces hard and unyielding. Ray had become one of them, not by choice, but by necessity. After the fight that had ruined his career, no one would hire him. The underground fight circuits barely paid enough to survive, and his father's condition only worsened. The cartel was the only option left. He walked through the camp, his gaze drifting to the horizon. Somewhere beyond those trees was the life his mother had chosen, the wealth, the luxury, and somewhere beneath it all, his father drank himself into oblivion, still mourning the woman who had walked out on them. Ray pushed the thoughts away as he approached the central tent. Inside, Jefe sat hunched over maps and documents, his back to the entrance. Jefe never showed his face. His voice was deep, steady, always calm. "We lost contact with one of the outposts. You're taking a crew to check it out." Ray nodded. "You got it. Don't come back till it's straightened out," Jefe said without turning around. Ray hesitated, then left the tent, a chill running down his spine. Even without seeing the man's face, Jefe's presence was suffocating. The journey through the jungle was grueling. Dense foliage closed in on all sides, vines twisting around ancient trees. The air was thick, humid, every breath a struggle. The buzzing of insects was relentless, their bites leaving angry red welts on exposed skin. Ray led the group, his eyes sharp, senses heightened. Years in the ring had taught him to be aware of his surroundings, to anticipate danger before it struck. One of the men cursed under his breath, swatting at a mosquito. "I hate this place. It feels cursed." Ray didn't disagree. There was something off about this part of the jungle, a heavy silence that pressed down on them, a feeling of being watched. They approached the outpost, the smell of decay hitting them like a physical blow. Bodies lay scattered, their faces twisted in agony. Flies buzzed around the corpses, the air thick with the stench of death. "Madre de Dios," one of the men whispered, crossing himself. Ray's jaw tightened. "Stay sharp. Whatever did this might still be here." They moved cautiously, weapons drawn. The outpost was in ruins, equipment smashed, supplies ransacked, but there were no bullet holes, no signs of a firefight. Just death. "Over here," one of the men called, pointing to a hidden path leading deeper into the jungle. Ray's heart raced. The path was old, overgrown, as if it hadn't been walked in centuries, but something about it felt wrong. They followed the path to a clearing, and Ray's breath caught in his throat. Half buried in thick vines, a obsidian shrine loomed before them, an ancient monolith forgotten by time. Its surface was unnaturally smooth, the black stone gleaming under the faint dappled sunlight that managed to pierce through the dense jungle canopy. Intricate carvings snaked across its facade, jaguars poised to strike, obsidian carvings reflecting anguished faces, and serpents coiling around the figure of Tezcatlipoca, the Mayan god of darkness and vengeance. The air grew colder as they approached, the sticky jungle humidity replaced by an unnatural chill that raised goosebumps on Ray's arms. A heavy silence hung over the clearing, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. One of the men shifted nervously, his eyes wide as he took in the eerie carvings. "Looks ancient," he muttered, his voice trembling. "Maybe we should turn back." Ray barely heard him. His attention was locked on the massive stone door at the shrine's entrance. It stood ajar, a crack of darkness visible between the slabs. Vines curled around the edges, but none crossed the threshold, as if even the jungle feared what lay inside. "It's open," another man whispered, his voice a mixture of awe and dread. Ray felt a pull, a strange compulsion that urged him forward. It was as if the shrine were breathing, its dark heart calling to him. Every instinct told him to turn and run, but his feet moved on their own, carrying him closer. The air grew colder still, his breath misting before him as he reached the doorway. The temperature plummeted, the chill sinking into his bones, his muscles locking with each step. He hesitated at the threshold, his pulse quickening. From behind him, one of the men took a step back, his face pale. "This place, it's cursed. We shouldn't be here." Ray's eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the door. A faint whisper drifted out, so soft he almost didn't hear it. A voice like wind over stone, like claws scraping against glass. His fingers brushed the cold stone as he crossed the threshold. A shiver ran down his spine. The darkness swallowed him whole. Inside, the air was frigid, cold enough that his breath came out in visible puffs, his skin prickling as the temperature continued to drop. The walls were covered in carvings, even more detailed than the ones outside. Jaguars prowled through shadows, their eyes gleaming with malice. Serpents coiled around obsidian statues that reflected distorted, anguished faces frozen in silent screams. Human figures twisted in agony, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways. Ray's heart hammered in his chest as his eyes moved over the statues. It was as if they were alive, the figures writhing just beneath the stone surface. The flickering torchlight danced over the walls, casting jagged shadows that seemed to move on their own. A low hum vibrated through the chamber, so faint he felt it more than heard it. The ground beneath his feet pulsed, a heartbeat echoing through the stone. Ray took another step forward, his eyes drawn to the center of the room. There, on a raised platform, stood an altar of obsidian, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen. Resting upon it was an ancient mask, its eyes hollow, its fanged mouth open in a silent roar. The gold inlays gleamed faintly, catching the weak light and throwing distorted reflections across the chamber. His feet moved on their own, carrying him toward the altar. His fingers twitched, an urge rising within him to reach out to touch the mask. Behind him, the others hesitated at the entrance, their faces pale. One of them whispered a prayer under his breath, his voice trembling. "This place ain't right, Ray. We should leave. Now." Ray's hand hovered over the mask, his fingers tingling as the air around it grew colder, the shadows deepening. A whisper slithered through the chamber, brushing against his mind like cold fingers trailing across his skin. "What do you seek?" "Power. Vengeance." His heart skipped a beat. He spun around, his eyes scanning the chamber, but the shadows were empty, the carvings frozen in place. "Ray!" one of the men shouted, his voice echoing. "We need to go, now." But the doorway was no longer open. The stone slabs had shifted, sealing them inside, the vines curling around the entrance like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder still, the darkness pressing in on them. The humming grew louder, the ground vibrating beneath them. The shadows on the walls began to move, writhing and twisting, peeling away from the stone. They gathered in the corners, coalescing into a thick, swirling mass of darkness. The men stumbled back, their faces contorted in fear. "Shit! What is that?" One of them screamed. The shadows surged forward, moving like living smoke, tendrils of darkness reaching out. They wrapped around the men, sinking into their skin, muffling their screams as they were pulled to the ground, their bodies convulsed, eyes rolling back, faces contorting in agony as the darkness consumed them. Ray's mouth went dry. his body paralyzed as he watched the shadows devour his crew. The darkness twisted around them, sinking beneath their flesh, the veins in their necks turning black as the corruption spread. One by one they fell, their eyes empty, their bodies motionless. Then the shadows turned toward him. They moved slowly, almost deliberately, circling him like predators. He could feel their eyes on him, cold and hungry. His heart raced, his limbs frozen, his breath coming out in short, ragged gasps. The darkness surged forward, tendrils reaching for him, and stopped. They hovered just inches away, curling and twisting, whispering to one another. The shadows moved around him, circling, observing. They sank into the floor, the walls, the ceiling, the entire chamber vibrating as they moved through the stone. Then the whisper came again, a voice echoing through his mind, ancient and cruel. You are different, worthy. The shadows surged upward, forming the outline of a jaguar, its eyes glowing with a cold golden light. It stood before him, massive and imposing, its fanged mouth open in a silent roar. Ray's body went numb, his knees buckling as the jaguar moved toward him, its eyes boring into his soul. The shadows poured into his mouth, his nose, his eyes, cold and suffocating, burning as they sank into his flesh. Pain exploded through his body, his muscles locking, his bones feeling like they were being crushed from within. His scream echoed through the chamber, raw and broken, the shadows twisting through his veins, seeping into his very essence. His vision blurred, the darkness consuming him, his body convulsing as the shadows claimed him. The last thing he saw was the jaguar's face, its eyes gleaming with ancient power, its roar echoing through his mind. Then everything went black. The shadows receded, leaving the chamber empty and silent. Ray lay motionless on the cold stone floor, his eyes closed, his body limp. Then his fingers twitched, his eyes snapped open, gleaming with a supernatural light, the mark of Tezcatlipoca burning within them. Ray stood, his body moving with inhuman grace, the shadows curling around his feet before dissipating. His expression was blank, his eyes cold, his mouth curling into a cruel smile. That wasn't his. He turned and walked out of the chamber. The jungle shivered as he passed, the shadows bowing before him. Tezcatlipoca had found his vessel.